The drawer sat open like a breach in the hull of a pristine ship. It was 8 p.m. The office lights dimmed to a low blue hum, the only sound the HVAC struggling against the summer heat. I had only walked in to drop off the revised offer letters. The leather-bound notebook lay splayed on the desk, ink dark and heavy against the cream paper. It wasn't meeting notes. It wasn't headcount projections. It was my name. Written in a loop of urgency, surrounded by sentences that made the air in the glass-walled room instantly thicken, charged with a sudden, terrifying heat. 12 hours later, the morning light hit those same glass walls, turning June's office into a blindingly bright interrogation room. She sat behind the desk, the drawer now locked, looking every inch the director of People Ops. June was architecture in human form, lines sharp, foundation unshakable. Outside, the startup was eating itself alive. The open floor plan was a riot of noise, sales gongs ringing, engineers debating meaningful code versus quick fixes, the frantic energy of a Series C company trying to justify its valuation. But in here, the silence was absolute, a vacuum. I sat across from her, my notepad open to a blank page, trying to reconcile the woman currently dissecting the Q3 attrition rates with the person who had pressed that pen into the paper with such force the ink had bled through. The scent of her espresso, burnt caramel and intensity, drifted across the gap between us. She clicked her expensive pen, a sharp, metallic tick that usually signaled the end of a negotiation. Today, it sounded like a warning shot. "Remy," she said, her voice a cool stream of water over stone. "The engineering bands. We need to calibrate before the board meeting." "Right," I said. "Calibration." The word tasted like ash. Because the calibration I was thinking about had nothing to do with salary bands. I was thinking about the words she had written. They weren't crude. They were unflinching. She had described the way I stood during the crisis meeting last week, the quiet authority I held when everyone else was shouting. She wrote about a desperate, clawing need to hand over the weight she carried, to let someone else, to let me, dictate the terms. It was a fantasy of power exchange so specific, so vulnerable. It felt like I had walked in on her naked. I watched her hands now, resting on the brushed aluminum of her laptop. They were steady, capable. The hands of a woman who fired people without blinking. But I knew that underneath that blazer, underneath the terrifying competence, there was a pulse hammering against a desire to lose control. The contrast was intoxicating. It was like finding a fault line running through a diamond. "You're staring," June noted, not looking up from her screen. "Just thinking," I lied, shifting in my chair. The leather creaked, a sound too loud for the room. "Don't think, execute," she murmured, a standard Juneism. She didn't know. She didn't know that the professional distance she had so carefully constructed, that thin, pristine pane of glass separating the director from the senior BP, was already spiderwebbed with cracks. I held the knowledge like a loaded weapon, unsure if I was protecting her or waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. The meeting was technically about retention, but as she looked up, eyes cool and guarded, I realized we were actually negotiating the terms of a surrender she didn't even know had begun. I built this department like a fortress. Every protocol, every workflow was designed to keep the chaos of a scaling startup from bleeding into the sanity of people operations. But the architect was exhausted. The Series C funding round was a grinder. I had spent 3 weeks living on espresso and adrenaline, smoothing over executive tantrums and drafting org charts obsolete by Friday. That exhaustion was the only reason the breach happened. I remembered it now, a sick feeling settling in my stomach like lead. Last night, the sudden crisis with the VP of engineering. I had scrambled for the severance files and dashed out. The lock on the bottom drawer, the one holding the only thing in this building that was truly mine, hadn't clicked. I knew the sound of that tumbler engaging better than my own heartbeat, and I hadn't heard it. And Remy had been the one to drop off the revised offers. I watched her across the desk, her head bent over her notes. Remy. She was the anomaly in my data set. In a company full of loud disruptors, she was standing water. deep, still, and dangerous. I relied on her. When the noise on the floor got too loud, I'd look for her silhouette just to calibrate my own breathing. That was the problem. You aren't supposed to want to collapse into your subordinate. You aren't supposed to look at the way they handle a difficult termination and wonder if those same capable hands could handle the sheer, crushing weight of you. The Notebook wasn't just about sex. It was about the cessation of decision-making. It was about the desperate, clawing need to stop being the one who held the roof up. I wanted to hand the keys to someone who wouldn't crash the car. I wanted Remy to look at me not as her boss, but as a problem she needed to solve, methodically and with absolute precision. I wrote about her voice, low and grounding, giving me orders I had no choice but to follow. I wrote about the relief of having no authority, just sensation, stripping away the pretense of control. I studied her face as she updated me on the engineering bands. Was she looking at me differently? There was a tightness around her eyes, a hesitation in her usually fluid cadence. Every time she shifted in that leather chair, my pulse spiked. Did she know? If she had opened that book, she held the codes to destroy me. Not professionally. HR violations were manageable, but personally. She would know that the director wanted to be directed, stripped of the blazer and the title. "June?" Her voice cut through the static. "The elevator's here." We had walked out together, autopilot taking over. The doors slid shut, sealing us in a steel box smelling of the sharp tang of electricity. We were alone for the first time all day. The descent was smooth, but my stomach dropped. She stood close enough that I could smell the rain on her coat, a scent of ozone and clean air. The space between our shoulders was less than an inch, a charged gap that felt heavy, magnetic, pulling me toward a collision I wasn't ready for. I stared at the floor numbers counting down, 4, 3, 2, terrified that if I looked at her, the gravity would finally win. The weeks that followed were a study in dual frequencies. On the surface, we were the same efficient machine, but underneath, the signal was jammed with static. Every email from her felt heavy in my inbox. We sat in performance reviews, discussing pain points and satisfaction metrics, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Our vocabulary had turned into a secret code. She was talking about head count. I was hearing the cadence of her breathing, remembering the loop of her handwriting. It came to a head in the break room on a rainy Tuesday. The espresso machine hissed, drowning out the sales team. I reached for the oat milk at the exact moment she did. It was a cliché, a scene from a bad rom-com, until our skin actually touched. It wasn't a spark. Sparks are flashy and quick. This was a current, a low-frequency hum that traveled up my arm and settled heavy in my chest. Her hand was cool, her fingers tense. She pulled back, but not before I felt the tremor running through her. She muttered an apology, gaze fixed on the counter. The air between us felt too thin. I decided to push. I had to know if the woman in the notebook was still in there, waiting to be let out. Later, during our 1-1, she was spiraling about the board deck. Her shoulders were up to her ears, the perfect blazer straining against the tension. She was talking about mitigating risk and controlling the narrative. I waited for a pause in the stream of logic. "June," I said, keeping my voice pitched low, the way I knew she liked. "You can't architect every outcome." She looked up, impatient, tapping her pen. "That's literally my job description, Remy." "I know," I said, leaning forward just enough to intrude on her personal space. "But sometimes, the desire to lose control is the only thing keeping the structure standing." It was a direct quote. Page 12, third paragraph. I watched the words land like stones in still water. The reaction was microscopic. If I hadn't been studying her like a complex algorithm, I would have missed it. Her typing stopped. Her pupils blew wide, swallowing the iris, black pools in the fluorescent light. For a second, the director was gone. The woman who wrote about surrender looked back at me, terrified and hungry. She didn't speak. She just stared, her mouth parting slightly, a silent plea for me to either stop or keep going forever. That was the shift. Before that moment, this was a crush, a dangerous infatuation with a boss who happened to be beautiful. But watching her mask slip, seeing the sheer exhaustion she was hiding behind that wall of competence, something in me clicked into place. This wasn't just about me wanting her. This was a circuit that had been waiting to close for months. She didn't just want me. She needed the specific frequency of silence I could offer. The tension in my gut wasn't fear. It was leverage. The afternoon blurred. The sun went down, the floor plan emptied, the frantic energy of the startup fading into the low, steady hum of the HVAC. We were the last two left, separated by glass and drywall, but the air felt shared. I sat at my desk, listening to the silence, knowing that just down the hall, she was listening to it too, waiting for the inevitable breach. The office at night felt like the inside of a deep-sea submersible. The pressure outside, the board expectations, the burn rate, the city demanding attention, pressed against the glass. But in here, the air was recycled and thin. I stared at the ominous red line of the attrition graph on slide 12. It was 9:30 p.m. The cleaning crew had already vacuumed around us, casting curious glances at the two women still tethered to their laptops in the dark. Remy was still here. That was the first breach of protocol. I should have sent her home hours ago. A good manager protects her team from burnout, but a selfish one keeps the only person who makes the room stop spinning within arm's reach. I watched her reflection in the dark window. She was focused, her brow furrowed in that specific way she got when she was untangling a complex compensation issue. It was the same look she had given me earlier when she quoted my own secret back to me, the desire to lose control. The words echoed in my skull, bouncing off the walls of my professionalism. It was terrifying. If she knew, I was compromised. I was the director of people ops. I was the ethical North Star of this chaotic organization. I drafted the fraternization policy. I lectured founders on power dynamics. I couldn't be fantasizing about my direct report reading me the riot act. And yet, watching the line of her neck as she tilted her head, the fear was being rapidly outpaced by a magnetic, heavy pull. It was a physical ache, a tension in the center of my chest that tightened every time she looked at me. "You're overthinking the narrative on the severance slide," Remy said. Her voice came from right beside me. I hadn't heard her move. I jumped, my hand jerking on the mouse. She didn't apologize. She just hooked her foot around the base of her chair and dragged it over, the wheels hissing softly on the industrial carpet. She parked herself in my personal space, a zone I guarded with the ferocity of a junkyard dog, and didn't even blink. "Let me see," she murmured. She didn't ask for permission. She reached out, her hand hovering over the trackpad. The proximity was a physical blow. I could smell the rain on her sweater, a damp, cool scent that cut through the stale office air and the sharp bitterness of old coffee. I could feel the heat radiating from her arm, inches from mine. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a traitorous drumbeat that had nothing to do with the board meeting. "Here," she said, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating in the small space between us. She leaned in to type over my shoulder, her arm brushing against my bicep. It was accidental contact, a glancing blow, but in the charged atmosphere of the empty office, with the ghost of my notebook lying between us, it felt like a brand. I stopped breathing. I stopped thinking about the slide deck. All my processing power diverted to where her wool sleeve met my silk blouse. I should move away. I should clear my throat and reestablish the boundary. That was the protocol. That was the job. But I didn't move. I stayed frozen, paralyzed not by fear, but by a sudden, overwhelming want. I wanted the collision. I wanted her to stop typing. I wanted her to turn that chair, lock eyes with me, and finish the sentence she started this morning. The silence stretched out, heavy and expectant, demanding a breach. The overhead lights finally surrendered to the building's automated timer, blinking out row by row until we were left in a pool of amber safety lighting. The office transformed instantly. The sharp edges of the glass walls softened, dissolving into the shadows, and the world narrowed down to the glow of the monitors and the two of us suspended in the quiet. It was atmospheric and heavy, the kind of silence that usually precedes a storm or a system failure. June let out a sigh that seemed to scrape the bottom of her lungs. She took her hand off the keyboard and rubbed her temples, dislodging a single strand of perfectly styled hair. It was a small imperfection, but on her, it looked like a collapse. "I don't know if the narrative holds," she whispered, staring at the glowing projections without really seeing them. "We're asking them to trust a vision that I'm not sure I can see anymore. The burn rate is too high. The structural integrity is compromised." She wasn't talking about the Series C anymore. Her voice had lost its polished executive sheen. It was raw, stripped of the acronyms and armor she wore like a second skin. She looked incredibly small in that ergonomic chair, crushed under the weight of being the one who had to have all the answers. I didn't think. The protocol manual in my head, the one that screamed about HR violations and professional boundaries, went silent. I watched her hand, still resting on the mouse, trembling slightly. It was the only sign of the tremors happening beneath the surface. I reached out. My hand covered hers. It wasn't a tentative gesture. I didn't hover. I grounded her. My palm pressed down over her knuckles, the warmth of my skin meeting the cold, clammy tension of hers. It felt like a suture closing a wound, a necessary medical intervention to stop the bleeding. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp jolt that bypassed the brain and went straight to the gut. June froze. Her breath hitched, a sharp intake of air that sounded loud in the empty room. I waited for the pullback. I waited for the director to snap back into place, to withdraw her hand and clear her throat and ask me to leave. But she didn't move. Instead, the tension in her arm unspooled. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her hand over beneath mine. The friction of palm against palm was deafeningly intimate. Her fingers didn't retreat. They curled upward, sliding between mine, locking us together over the quarterly projections. Her grip was tight, desperate, an anchor finding the seabed. "Remy," she said, her voice dropping into a register I had never heard in the boardroom. It was low, rough with a need she was done hiding. "We're drifting off strategy here." "Are we?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my own pulse was hammering against the underside of her wrist. "Or are we finally looking at the real data?" She turned her head slowly to look at me. Her eyes were wide, dark pools in the dim light, searching my face. There was no director left in them, just the woman who had filled a notebook with ink and longing. "The risk assessment," she murmured, her thumb tracing a slow, hypnotic circle against my skin. "It's catastrophic. If we miscalculate—" "High risk," I countered, leaning in until I could smell the mint and coffee on her breath, until the heat radiating from her body became my own atmosphere. "But the reward potential? It's unflinching." I used her word. I threw it down like a gauntlet between us. June flinched, just barely. Her pupils blew wide, swallowing the gold irises. She knew that I knew. The coded language of business dissolved. We weren't talking about the company. We were negotiating the terms of a merger that had nothing to do with finance. "You read it," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I read it," I confirmed, tightening my grip on her hand, feeling the dampness of her palm, the reality of her skin against mine. "And June, you don't have to hold the roof up right now. You can just let go." The air in the room shifted from professional camaraderie to undeniable intent. The slide deck on the screen was forgotten. The desk was no longer a workspace. It was the only thing keeping us from colliding. I knew, with absolute clarity, that I had to be the one to bridge the final gap. She had written the invitation, but I had to be the one to walk through the door. The firewall didn't just fail. It dissolved. Remy's admission, I read it, should have been a death sentence for us both. In any other context, in any other fiscal quarter, this was a termination event. A breach of privacy, a lawsuit waiting to happen.
My HR brain? The part of me that lived in flowcharts, liability waivers, and risk mitigation was screaming to pull my hand back. It demanded I draft a disciplinary memo, escort her from the building, and scrub the hard drive of my life. But the rest of me? The part that had been suffocating under the polyester weight of executive expectations? That part was taking its first full breath in a decade.
The truth was worse than I feared. She hadn't just glanced at the notebook. She had understood it. She had seen the raw, unpolished architecture of my need, the messy, desperate scaffolding I used to hold myself upright, and she hadn't looked away. She wasn't looking away now. Her gaze was steady, heavy with an intent that made my skin prickle. It was the same look I had described on page 20, a look that didn't ask for permission, but assumed it. "Why?" I managed to whisper. It was a weak question, unworthy of my title, stripped of all authority. "Why didn't you report it? Why are you still sitting here holding my hand?" Remy didn't blink. Her thumb brushed the sensitive skin of my inner wrist again, sending a fresh wave of static through my nervous system. "Because the data points match, June. You wrote about a need for silence, for someone to take the wheel, and I've been watching you drive this car off a cliff for months." She was using my logic against me. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. "It's a violation," I said, though my voice lacked any real conviction. I was arguing the case for the sake of the record, not because I wanted to win. Ethically, professionally, us, it's a conflict of interest so large it could swallow the department. If I admit that those words are real, I lose the high ground. "You don't need the high ground right now," Remy countered, her voice dropping lower, vibrating in the quiet office. "You need the ground, solid ground. Or it could be a merger, a strategic acquisition of what we both actually want." I looked at her, really looked at her. The way her dark hair fell across her forehead, the competence in her shoulders, the absolute lack of judgment in her eyes. She was offering me a way out of the cage I had built. She was offering to be the one person I didn't have to manage. I had to own it. If I was going to jump, I had to look at the fall. It wasn't creative writing, I confessed, the words scraping my throat. The proximity, the control. I didn't write it to vent. I wrote it because every time you walk into my office, I have to remind myself to breathe. I wrote it because I wanted you to know, but I was too coward to say it. The unflinching nature of the moment hit me. I had written that word as a fantasy, a descriptor for a fictionalized version of her. But the reality was sharper. She was here, risking her own career, reaching across the literal and metaphorical barrier of my desk to offer me a lifeline. I made the calculation. I ran the risk assessment in a split second. The career capital I had hoarded, the reputation for icy perfection, the safety of the glass walls. I weighed it all against the feeling of her hand on mine. The ROI was undeniable. The merger was the only viable path forward. "If I let go," I said, my voice steadying as I finally made the choice, "I'm not going to take it back. I don't do half measures, Remy. If we breach this protocol, we burn the rule book. There is no going back to the way it was before you opened that drawer." Remy smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips that I wanted to taste more than I wanted my next breath. "Burn it," she said. "I've got the matches." The desk was still between us. That massive, imposing slab of reclaimed wood that served as my command center. It felt ridiculous now. A barricade for a war that was already over. I pulled my hand from hers, not to retreat, but to act. I pushed my chair back. The wheels rolled smoothly over the carpet, a sound of finality in the quiet room. I stood up. My legs felt shaky, but my resolve was iron. I walked around the edge of the desk, closing the physical distance until the only thing separating us was the charged air and the terrifying promise of what came next. She moved around the desk like she was stepping off a ledge. The click of her heels on the industrial carpet was the only sound in the room, a steady metronome counting down the seconds until impact. I stood up to meet her. My legs felt heavy, grounded, as if gravity had suddenly doubled in the square footage between us. Standing this close, without the mahogany barrier of her command center, June looked different. The architectural sharpness of her blazer softened in the dim light. I could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat, a frantic human rhythm that betrayed the calm mask she was trying to hold against the flood. She stopped inches from me. The air between us wasn't just charged. It was thick, humid with the storm we had both been holding back for months. I didn't reach for her immediately. I let the proximity settle, letting the heat radiating from her body map itself onto mine. Then, she reached out. Her hands, usually so precise with a pen or a keyboard, found the lapels of my jacket. They weren't shaking anymore. They were demanding. She pulled me in, not with a rough jerk, but with a steady, undeniable tension. It was a calibration, a realignment of coordinates. When her lips met mine, it wasn't the frantic collision of a rom-com finale. It was deliberate. It was a question asked and answered in the same breath. She tasted of the double espresso she'd nursed all afternoon and the sharp, clean mint of her breath. But beneath that, there was something uniquely her, a warmth that smelled like rain on hot pavement and expensive perfume. My hands found her waist, sliding over the silk of her blouse, feeling the rigid line of her spine relax under my touch. The edge of the desk dug into my hip, a cool, hard reminder of where we were, but it felt miles away, utterly irrelevant against the heat of her skin. The fantasy in the notebook had been about power, about me taking control. But the reality was far more complex. It wasn't a takeover, it was a synchronization. Her mouth moved against mine with a hunger that was raw and immediate, stripping away the director title until she was just a woman breathing my air. We broke apart, but only by millimeters. Her forehead rested against mine, her eyes closed, lashes fluttering against her cheeks. "The protocol," she whispered, her voice wrecked, a beautiful ruin of her usual professional cadence. "It's gone." "It was never there," I murmured back, my thumb tracing the line of her jaw, feeling the tension finally bleed out of the masseter muscle. "It was just a delay tactic." She let out a shaky laugh, a sound of pure relief that vibrated against my chest. "I thought the writing was too much, too specific. I thought the reality would disappoint." "The writing was a blueprint," I told her, looking into her eyes as they fluttered open, dark and dilated in the shadows. This is the build. The notebook was static, ink on paper, safe. This is volatile." "I don't want safe," she breathed, her hands tightening on my shoulders, fingers digging into the fabric. "I want the risk." The corporate jargon sounded different here, stripped of its armor, turned into a confession. We weren't discussing assets. We were admitting that the investment we were making in this moment outweighed every other metric in the building. She pulled me back in, deeper this time, her hands tangling in my hair, anchoring herself. The kiss slowed down, finding a rhythm, a cadence, that felt like it had been established years ago, not seconds. We stood there in the dim blue light of the server indicators and the city glow, mapping the new territory between us with the slow, deliberate exploration of cartographers discovering a new continent. The glass walls that had defined our hierarchy were just windows now. The office wasn't a fortress of silence anymore. It was just a room. And for the first time since I started this job, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. The hum of the HVAC system, usually a lonely sound, now felt like a heartbeat we shared. The alarm cut through the dark at 6 a.m., a sharp digital intrusion. Usually, the morning after a breach of protocol, especially one involving a direct report and the erasure of every professional boundary I'd spent a decade building, is defined by a hangover of pure, distilled panic. I lay there in the gray light of my apartment, listening to the city wake up, waiting for the regret to hit. I waited for the internal tribunal to convene and list the charges. Fraternization, exposure, The sheer stupidity of risking a director title for the taste of mint and coffee. But the panic didn't come. Instead, there was a humming silence in my chest. It was a grounded, heavy quiet, filling the space where the frantic noise of what if used to be. I showered, the hot water unable to scrub away the phantom sensation of Remy's hands on my waist. I put on the armor, the silk blouse, the tailored blazer, the heels that sounded like gunfire in the hallway. But it didn't feel like a costume today. It felt like clothes. The desperate need to protect the perfect executive facade had evaporated, replaced by a strange, calm certainty. I wasn't empty anymore. I was occupied territory. Walking into the building felt like re-entering a crime scene, where nothing had been stolen, but everything had been rearranged. The lobby was the same sterile expanse of polished concrete and aggressive branding, but the air felt thinner, easier to breathe. I saw Remy before she saw me. She was by the reception desk, talking to the office manager about badge access. Just the curve of her back in that navy sweater sent a jolt through me that was less like fear and more like fuel. When she turned, catching my eye across the atrium, the world didn't tilt. It steadied. There was no frantic looking away, no guilty shuffle. She held my gaze for a beat longer than professional courtesy dictated, a look that acknowledged the map we had drawn in the dark. It was a glance that carried the weight of a history book. In that split second, we had a conversation without speaking a word. I'm here. I remember. We're okay. I walked to the elevator, my heels clicking a rhythm that felt authoritative again, but for a different reason. I wasn't projecting power to hide a crack in the foundation. I was walking on reinforced concrete. The weight of the unspoken rules was gone. The complication arrived at 10 a.m. in the form of a budget review with the CEO. David was pacing the conference room, manic with energy about the burn rate. He stopped mid-sentence when I walked in. He squinted at me, tapping a marker against his chin, analyzing me like a bug in the code. "You look different," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Did we fix the attrition numbers? You look like you actually slept for once, or like you know something I don't." My heart did a single hard thud against my ribs. In the past, I would have hedged. I would have deflected with data. But today, I just set my laptop down, the metal cool against my fingertips. "I recalibrated the risk assessment," I said, my voice steady, unflinching. "We're focusing on internal stability. The foundation is stronger than we thought." David bought it, distracted by the next crisis, but the close call vibrated in the air. He sensed the shift. The energy between Remy and me wasn't just a private current anymore. It was powerful enough to register on the organizational seismograph. We couldn't just exist in the stolen moments of late-night office silence. The glass walls were transparent. We needed to define this. We needed a new protocol, one written outside the building, away from the prying eyes of founders and the ghosts of my own hesitation. We chose a bistro 3 neighborhoods away from the office, deep in a part of the city where the startup ecosystem held no sway. Here, nobody cared about burn rates or Series C valuations. The air smelled of roasted garlic and red wine, not ozone and stress. It was neutral ground, a demilitarized zone where the glass walls couldn't reach us. June sat across from me, stripped of the blazer. In a soft, charcoal sweater, she looked less like a monument to efficiency and more like a person who had just survived a shipwreck. She was trying to read the menu, but I could see her eyes scanning the room, checking for familiar faces, analyzing the exits. The habit was hard to break. "We need a strategy," she said, her voice pitching low to cut under the clatter of silverware. She didn't look up. "The fraternization policy is explicit regarding direct reporting lines. If we pursue this, the conflict of interest is immediate. I can draft a disclosure form by Monday, but—" "June," I interrupted, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "Stop." She froze, her hand tightening on the stem of her water glass. "No hedging," I said, "and no drafting. We aren't at work. You don't have to solve the logic puzzle right this second." She finally looked at me. The vulnerability in her eyes was stark. It was the look of someone who had handed over a loaded weapon, her journal, and was waiting to see if I'd use it. "I don't know how to do this without a protocol," she admitted. "The notebook, it was a script. It had rules. You were in charge, and I just had to follow. Real life isn't that clean." I reached across the small table. I didn't take her hand. Too public for her, not yet. But I rested my fingers near hers on the white tablecloth, a proximity that offered heat without demanding it. The notebook was flattering, I told her, and I meant it. To be the one holding the reins, to be the object of that kind of surrender, it's heady. But June, that was a one-dimensional fantasy. It was a pressure valve for your stress. I don't want to be your stress relief. Her breath hitched. "That's not what—" "I know," I pressed on. "But I don't want the character you wrote. I don't want the director who needs 20 minutes of submission to function. I want the woman who forgets to lock her drawer. I want the person who is terrified right now because she can't control the outcome. I want the real version." The silence that stretched between us was different than the office silence. It wasn't heavy with expectation. It was open. June slowly let go of the menu. She slumped back in her chair, the director persona sliding off her shoulders like a heavy coat she was finally too hot to wear. "I need a partner," she whispered. The admission was quiet, but it hit with the force of a shout. "I'm tired of being the architecture, Remy. I need someone who can live in the house with me, not just admire the foundation." "Then we navigate the HR complexity together," I said. "We figure out the disclosure. We handle the audit. But we do it as a team. The suture holds, June. We closed the distance. I'm not going to let it rip open again just because the paperwork is messy." She looked at me, and a slow, genuine smile broke through the tension. It wasn't a networking smile. It was raw. "Okay," she said. "Terms accepted." The waiter arrived to take our order, breaking the moment. But the connection remained, a taut, invisible line running under the table, binding us tighter than any contract ever could. It took 6 months for the dust to settle. The Series C closed, the valuation held, and the startup stabilized into something that felt less like a burning building and more like a functioning company. My life followed the same trajectory. The frantic need that had filled the notebook didn't disappear, but it evolved. It wasn't a shameful secret anymore. It was the steady, grounding rhythm of my Tuesday mornings. Waking up with Remy was a protocol I never wanted to optimize. The light filtering through her curtains, we spent more time at her place, away from the sterile minimalism of mine, painted the room in soft golds. Watching her sleep, her hair messy against the pillow, was the only data point I needed to start the day. We had a routine now. The commute wasn't a terrifying elevator ride of silence. It was shared podcasts and hands brushing on the subway train, a merger of our private and public selves that felt seamless. We were no longer two satellites orbiting a collision. We were a binary star system, moving in tandem. We navigated the disclosure forms. We survived the awkward meeting with legal, where we sat side by side and laid our conflict of interest on the table like a winning hand. And then came the real test, the Q4 restructuring. Layoffs are the ugliest part of people ops. It's where the human element gets stripped down to severance packages and exit scripts. In the past, I would have armored up, turned into the Ice Queen, and absorbed the toxicity alone until I cracked. But this time, Remy was there. Not just as a subordinate executing orders, but as a partner in the trenches. We sat in the war room for 10 hours straight, finalizing the lists. When my hands started to shake, just a tremor of fatigue and guilt, she didn't say a word. She just slid a cup of tea across the mahogany table, catching my eye. That look. It was the same one from the break room, the same one from the night the drawer was open. It said, "I've got you." And she did. We walked out of that building together, the weight distributed evenly between us, the burden shared so perfectly it almost felt light. The fear that had once paralyzed me, the fear of being seen, was real, but the pull of her strength was infinitely stronger. The callback happened a week later. I was digging through my bag for a board deck, stressed and running late for a sync with the founders. My fingers brushed against paper. Not a file, a small, folded piece of cardstock. I pulled it out right there in the hallway. It was Remy's handwriting this time. No flowery prose, no desperate fantasy, just a simple note. You don't have to be the architect today. Just be June. I'll handle the roof. I stood there, the office buzzing around me, and felt a smile crack the professional veneer wide open. The notebook in the drawer had been a cry for help, a fantasy of surrender. This note was the answer. It was the reality. The unflinching connection I had craved wasn't about losing control. It was about sharing it. The desk drawer was locked now, but it didn't matter. The secret was out, and it was better than the fantasy. We had built something that didn't need to be hidden in the dark. We had built a life that could stand the light. The rain against the window of our shared apartment sounds different than it did against the glass walls of the office. Here, away from the servers, the noise, and the sensors, it's a rhythm, not a distraction. June is sitting in the vintage armchair by the balcony, her legs tucked under her, reading a physical book. Not a pitch deck, not a compliance audit. The tension that used to define her, that rigid architectural spine she wore like armor, is soft now, curved into the cushions. I watch her turn a page, the lamp casting a warm glow on the hands that used to terrify interns. My mind drifts back to the error that started it all, the open drawer. It feels like a glitch from a legacy system we've long since upgraded. Sometimes, when the city lights blur in a specific way, I shudder thinking about how close we came to missing the signal. If she had turned that key, if she had checked the lock during that fire drill, we would still be two satellites orbiting the same chaotic star, burning up on re-entry, but never truly touching. That breach of protocol was the single most profitable risk of our careers. We didn't just survive the potential fallout, we leveraged it. We navigated the HR minefield with the same precision June used to apply to headcount reductions. There were close calls, certainly. Elevator rides where the silence was too loud, glances across the boardroom that lingered a fraction of a second too long, but the foundation held. The unflinching nature of those frantic, ink-stained notes became the code we wrote our real lives with. It wasn't about the illicit thrill of the secret anymore. It was about the resilience of the bond. We built a structure that could withstand the pressure of the startup grind, the late nights, and the exhaustion, because we knew the safe house waiting for us at the end of the shift. The old notebook sits on our bookshelf now, closed but not hidden. She looks up, sensing my gaze. The director mask is gone, dusty and forgotten in some emotional storage unit. In its place is the partner who held me when my own burnout hit, the woman who knows exactly how I take my coffee, the architect who helped me build a life that isn't defined by quarterly returns. "What are you analyzing?" she asks, a smile playing on her lips, the real one. The one that reaches her eyes. "Just reviewing the assets," I say, walking over to sit on the arm of her chair. She leans into me, her head resting against my hip. The connection is finally solid, permanent. The tension that once coiled in my gut, sharp and dangerous, has transmuted. It's no longer a live wire waiting to shock us. It's the steady, simple, humming current that powers everything we are. The elevator doors slide open to the lobby, and we step out into the cool night air, finally leaving the glass tower behind. Her hand finds mine, fingers interlacing without hesitation, defying the city to challenge the claim. Sometimes the most critical merger isn't in the boardroom. It's in the quiet surrender to a shared orbit. If you've ever found a return on investment in an unexpected place, subscribe to hear more stories of unflinching connection.